Welcome to Tales from the Fandom, a podcast that brings a special guest out of the multiverse and straight to you. And now your host, David Ginsburg.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Tales from the Fandom. We are joined today by Keith Baker, who is an incredibly great game designer and author, who you may know has done Eberron or some other projects. And this is definitely an episode that is definitely Dungeons and Dragons heavy, or role-playing game heavy. So if that's not your thing, I totally understand if you're not interested in listening to it. But it's definitely a fun one for me, and it was a great honor to have Keith on. The Kickstarter that we talked about, Action Cats, which I did leave in as part of the episode, was a previously released mini episode earlier in the year when the Kickstarter was happening. Obviously, the Kickstarter is done. It succeeded, which is fantastic. And I don't believe they're open for pre-orders yet for Action Cats for people that didn't back it on Kickstarter. But when it does, I will make sure that it is available and noted in our Facebook page and notes and whatnot. However, a project that Keith did work on, Illimat, is available for pre-orders. It's a card game that he designed alongside the Decemberists. So that website and information is going to be in the show notes. So definitely give that a look and check it out. And of course, I would be remiss without putting in some podcast promos for podcasts that are great. And definitely check them out. One is Dungeons and Dragons, who also have an episode coming out this month for our podcast. And then the other is Poplar Cove. So take a listen, and then you'll be joining Keith and I talking all sorts of gaming stuff. Have a great day, guys.
Hey there, we're Dungeons and Dragons. Quick, what do we do here?
We're going to roll some dice,
make some terrible jokes,
toss in a wacky inflatable arm flailing tube man, and you've got a party!
It's so much pun. Sorry about that.
Yeah. We're Dungeons and Dragons, a D&D 5th edition actual play podcast where we are building a world through the collaborative storytelling that is Dungeons and Dragons.
we like to have fun,
Laughs, thrills, and adventure.
Join us by subscribing to Dungeons and Dragons through iTunes or wherever you download podcasts.
Find us at dumbdragons.com.
Welcome to Poplar Cove, everyone. This town follows its own set of rules.
Who are the Great Old Ones? Is that a rock band or something?
You don't know of the Great Old Ones? Powerful deities from space? With physical appearances that no human being could comprehend? Unless, of course, you drink enough coffee.
Summon him with caution, as mere men who have spoken with this beast have gone mad. Well, that's silly.
She talked about elder gods and how they have tentacles. If an elder god were to try and eat me, I should try to punch it in the nose and... No, wait, maybe that was sharks.
Fine, if you're not going to play nice.
This reminds me of my favorite soap opera.
Oh, Hobart, darling, I'm so glad that you're awake.
Oh my, she looks delicious. I would like to smother her in barbecue sauce, and nope, that's not right. What's going on in my head?
Are you dizzy, seeing double, hallucinating, delirious? Are you seeing characters from some foreign language floating up from the carpet? Are they forming words that you're suddenly privy to? Do you hear chanting of some kind when you're alone? Are they telling you how to summon the beast?
I'm fine.
And welcome back to another episode of Tales from the Fandom. Today I am joined by one of my favorite creators of a Dungeons and Dragons setting. You have heard me talk about it multiple times before, and that is the Eberron campaign world that's in Dungeons and Dragons. And Keith Baker is here. He's not only done that setting, he's done other games and novelizations and even more stuff. So welcome to the podcast, Keith.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Now, before we get into tabletop gaming, I did have a question come in from one of my Eberron role players, because I'm running an Eberron game, and he asked me to ask you if you are the author of Mr. and Mrs. Green or the Elemental Peas.
I am not. So there is another Keith Baker out there who is a renowned children's book author and has done many books. And what I will say is that many years ago, probably 20 years ago, well before Eberron, when I was actually working in the computer game industry, and at the time, I think I was only an assistant designer. I wasn't even lead designer. And I got a invitation to go talk at an elementary school on email. And I was sort of sitting there being like, I don't know, I guess they want kids to learn about opportunities in the computer game industry. I guess I could do that. Needless to say, I figured out what was going on, and definitely for a period of about 6 or 7 years, I would every year get 1 or 2 invites to go talk to grade schools, and have to write and say, nope, different Keith Baker. I think he's gotten his online presence more established, and I'm pretty sure he lives in Seattle. We've exchanged email once or twice, just because I tried to track him down so I could point people his direction. So no, I did not write Cat Trick or The Big Hen or anything like that.
Okay, I'll have to let my player know, because when you pull it up on Amazon, for all the Eberron material, It also has your Keith Baker as attached to that.
My highly successful children's book career. If it was me, there'd be more Medusas and more Forged in the kids' book.
There you go. Now, how did you get into tabletop gaming? Was it something that happened just through high school or middle school, and then you got into it that way, or how did you find tabletop gaming?
Even earlier, when I was around 8 or 9, I think, maybe even earlier than that, my mother got me the white box for D&D and a couple of the AD&D books. And at the time, I didn't have anyone to play with, and it was AD&D in particular was a little complex for me to do, but I love the books because, at the time, I'd read Lord of the Rings, I'd read, I liked mythology, and I think she just picked them up saying, oh, it seems to be the sort of fantasy stuff. But a book like the Monster Manual or the Deities and Demigods, again, drop back 40 years, and there just wasn't other stuff like this out there. It's like, this is a book of monsters, and it has all these cool pictures, and it tells you what they can do, and it was just sort of the coolest thing. So basically, I was reading these books, as I said, when I was like 8 or 9, and then it was probably 5th or 6th grade, I think 5th grade, that I actually started running games for my friends. And then it just went from there. And certainly I knew, like, when I was in high school, I knew, like, okay, this is the job I want to have. Like, someone makes these books. So I don't know how you get that job, but this is what I want to do. I went to college. I studied creative writing and history, got out of college, still didn't know how to get that job. And I ended up getting into computer game design just because basically there was an opportunity. And I worked for about 8 years in computer game design. During that time, I did figure out how to start writing for role-playing. And the very first thing I did was for Atlas Games had an open call for their Over the Edge system. And I wrote a bunch of stuff for them. And meanwhile, I'd gotten to be like a lead designer in computer games, but I had 2 games I worked on for 3 years each that were great games, and both of them ended up getting canceled in beta due to just office politics stuff, sort of stupid reasons. And it was very frustrating when you put that much work into something that's really good, and it just, dies for no good reason. And so it was 2002, 2003, I forget which. I ended up basically at that point doing enough freelance work for Atlas, Goodman, Green Ronin that I decided, well, I'm just going to quit and just try being a full-time freelancer and see what happens. Mm-hmm. And that was the year that Wizards of the Coast did the fantasy setting search. I submitted Eberron, and that all worked out pretty well. But I am definitely one of the luckiest nerds in the world to have those opportunities.
Absolutely. I talked with another author, Matt Forbeck, who got to write some of the Eberron novels, and I'd asked him how it was to be writing novels at the same time as you were creating the Eberron world, so to speak. And he had said that it was wonderful because he was in an area, like his setting and his books were in somewhere that it didn't really matter as much for him as a writer, having to deal with things changing in like the canon publication of the novels. So he told me he had a great time writing them because wasn't like as restricted as sometimes his other novels where they're changing things day to day. Like, oh, you've got to change this because we're changing it in the video game that we're releasing.
Right. And I think with the Eberron novels in general, one of the things we did decide very early on is that we weren't going to make the Eberron novels canon. That the novels for Eberron, compared to Dragonlance or Forgotten Realms, where the novels define the setting, in Eberron, what we basically said is it was important to us that in your Eberron campaign, your characters really are the heroes. That we don't want to establish a bunch of sort of big heroes that are theoretically cooler than you are. And so to us all along, the idea was that Eberron novels should be inspiration. They should be something that tell you this is the kind of adventure your characters could have. But even looking to my first series of novels, in The Shattered Land, they go to Zendrik and they find this artifact, the Docent Shira. And when I wrote Secrets of Zendrik, I gave stats for Shira, but I didn't mention my characters or Pierce at all. The whole point was I want you to find her, and you to decide what to do with her. And that does, the flip side of that is it does make it a little easier for us as authors of not having to quite pay attention to sort of the previous 20 novels that have been around. With that said, I'll note when I wrote the Thorn books, when I had in The Queen of Stone, the main character goes to a sort of summit in the Great Crag in Droam. And I did actually reach out to Don Basingthwaite and say, hey, I've got a delegation here from Dargoon. Who do you think should be in that? Because he'd been writing all the books set in Dargoon. And I was like, do you want to, suggest a character who should appear in that? So it's fun having that kind of crossover. Back to your point, though, I'll also say I ran into a little trouble of that, not with the setting canon, but with systems. Because, I do try when I'm writing a D&D novel, I want it to at least be possible. It's none of my novels are actually based on games I've run, but I always in my mind wanted to say if my character does something, I could explain how they would do that mechanically, like how Lee in the Dreaming Dark series, every sort of magic she does, I could tell you exactly what it is she's done there, even though within the novel we don't describe them. It's not like she says, oh, I just cast inflict, major damage. But I could still tell you these are the 4 things she's done. Now, when I was writing the Thorn books, the first novel, they were still in 3.5. And the second novel, when I was writing it, they shifted to 4th edition. And there were a bunch of changes that I'm sure they didn't think were a big deal at all. But one of the critical things is in 3rd edition, dragons have blind sense. And in 4th edition, they don't. And there is a major plot point in the novel that deals with the fact that dragons have these incredible senses. And I just ignored it and stuck with it and, kept going. And, well, this dragon has incredible senses. But when I noticed that, I'm like, such a pain. So there you go.
How did you come up with the world of Eberron?
So the funny thing is I told you that I was working on computer games that got canceled. And the game I've been working on just before I quit was called Lost Continents. And it was a pulp-themed MMO. So sort of The Mummy, Raiders of the Lost Ark, all of that. And I've been working on it for 3 years. And in the process of that, I've been watching a ton of Republic serials, movies from that period. And so I had sort of pulp in my mind, the pulp flavor. And I've also just personally, I've always loved film noir. And So that was one factor. Is one thing was when the setting came up. So Eberron was something I made up for the setting search. It wasn't a world I've been running before. And the first piece of it was saying, well, what if you took that sort of pulp noir 40s adventure flavor and put that into a D&D setting? And then the second part of it is just something that's always been a thing of mine, is I like fantasy to make sense. I like to feel like if this magic existed in this world, this is how things would happen. And the thing about it is that magic in Dungeons and Dragons behaves like science. A wizard can cast the same spell reliably this many times a day. They can teach that spell to another wizard. They can learn a new spell from a book. It's a formula and it works. It's not mysterious. There's no sort of unknown quantity about it. And so to me, it was very much this thing of, in a setting like Forgotten Realms, you have these incredibly powerful wizards, and yet for the most part, in that time, it's a thing like Lord of the Rings, where wizards live in ivory towers and they don't affect the world. And in Lord of the Rings, that makes sense, because wizard isn't an occupation. It's literally like a race. You are this sort of demigod. But in D&D, it is an occupation. It's a thing you can learn. And so to me, it was always this thing of, why doesn't it actually get used to solve the problems we solve with technology and science? Eberron was just this idea to me of, if we'd had arcane magic as it works in D&D in the Renaissance, what would the world look like today? How would a world that solved the issues of travel, communication, medicine, if our tools for solving those problems were magic as presented in D&D, what would that look like? So a lot of people say of Eberron that it's high magic, usually as a criticism. And the point of Eberron is it's not high magic, is that Forgotten Realms has more powerful casual magic out in the world. What Eberron is wide magic. Because the second aspect of Eberron is saying that high-level characters are rare. And so what that means is that 0 through 3rd level magic is very prevalent out in the world. So people light the streets with continual flame. They, chill and heat things with prestidigitation. They use fireballs in war. That these things are out there. But resurrection, teleportation, the sort of more powerful spells are still sort of wondrous and mysterious. And if your character can become, a 12th level wizard, you are this sort of legendary figure. But wrapping all that around, like I said, it was really the combination of those two things, of me wanting a world where magic really was sort of a logical part of the world, and then combining that with that sort of pulp flavor of sort of over-the-top adventure where your heroes are sort of larger than life, and then noir, where it's, you can have stories that don't end well, where good and evil are not so clear cut, where, there aren't easy answers. And so that was sort of the genesis, was mashing all of those things together. In pitching Eberron, I believe the one sentence thing I started with was Lord of the Rings meets Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Maltese Falcon. Mm-hmm. And just trying to say it's fantasy, and yet at the same time, you've got both the pulp adventure, the noir sort of shades of gray, and then magic really being explored in a deeper way than it generally had been.
One of my favorite things about the Eberron setting is that not only do you get new player races as far as Warforged or Shifters, Changelings, you also get, and the Kalashtar, I can't forget them, you also get reworkings of the traditional races. Like, the elves are totally different. Half-elves are their own basic race at this point. Mm-hmm. Halflings ride dinosaurs. I mean, and that was one of the things that drew me to it was, I think someone had said, oh, I'm going to run a Eberron campaign. Here's the book. And I was flipping through the book. I was like, there's a halfling riding a dinosaur. on top of all the, other cool stuff that was in there.
Well, and part of the point to me of that was just, again, Wizards of the Coast had Forgotten Realms, and they weren't going to stop doing Forgotten Realms. And so a big thing to me was, well, it should be different. You know, if you want classic Tolkienian elves, you've already got them over there. And it's similar to our approach with deities, where we basically took a very different approach with deities, said gods don't manifest in the world, faith really matters. And a big part of that is because if you want gods stomping around doing things, you've got it in FR. And I wanted to take an approach that really let you tell different stories that don't work in that kind of world. And beyond that, to me, it's also a second point of, like I said, I really like thinking about a thing and then logically considering how would this develop. So the whole point of the elves is when you look at the elves in 3rd edition, elves could live up to 1,000 years. And one of the things that struck me about that is if you live 1,000 years, it's going to be really hard sort of losing people because you're just used to them being around for so long. And so all of the major elven cultures are basically revolve around the idea of avoiding death. That you have the Undying Court, you know, basically how do we keep our greatest souls from being lost? And so with the Undying Court, they actually preserve them as sort of positively charged undead, and they continue to lead the nation. Whereas with the Ternadal, they are basically about, we preserve our greatest heroes by essentially becoming avatars for their spirits. We reenact their deeds, and through that, they continue to live on through us. And, you know, both of those gave us these very different style of the Ternadal sort of highly sort of focused warriors, compared to the Arini being sort of, isolationist, you know, focused on tradition in the past. But as I said, it was a way to sort of really explore them in a different way, and tied to that idea of they're people who don't want to let go. It also ties to me of when you have a race that's that old and that long lived, and yet somehow humanity has, in its much shorter period of civilization, managed to at least be relatively relevant, if that makes any sense. What that says to me is that the elves are stuck. You know, they may be really good at what they do, but they're not innovating. Because if they've had 25,000 years to innovate, they're that far ahead of humanity, they should already know everything, if you see what I'm saying. Right. And so thus, the elven cultures really are about tradition and looking back. So they're very, very good at what they do. You know, the Valinor are some of the best warriors around, and yet the idea is they're doing the same things. Whereas humanity in a relatively short time is basically accomplishing things that, you know, they've never actually bothered to do. One of the things, it's a trivial point, people talk about the fact that by the player's handbook, technically an elf wizard should be like, you know, 110 starting out, whereas a human wizard is 21. And a lot of people are like, well, why are elves so dumber? You know, why does it take an elf 100 years to master something that the human masters in a decade? And my point of that is it's because their magic is totally different. That the elf might spend 5 years literally just mastering a particular incantation because they can. And that the idea is like the elven wizard, when they cast a fireball, they are not just using the same formula and gesture and such as the person who made it. They are literally using the precise pronunciation. You know, they've mastered the accent. Whereas when humans do magic, they've actually kind of learned that really you can just kind of personalize it. And, you know, the incantations I use may not even be exactly the same as the ones you use, because I've figured out what works best for me. And that an elf hearing you cast your fireball just shudders at the, you know, your form is so terrible. You know, spend another 5 years getting your finger positions correct, sir. And so it's not that an elf has to spend a century learning to do magic. It's that culturally they do, because it's so precise and so bound to their traditions, that it's just all about the style and the cultural value. And obviously, I love gnomes, you know, and again, it was sort of coming back to saying, okay, you got gnomes. They're not very strong. They're very sneaky. They have a natural talent for illusion and alchemy. You know, well, okay, they're not going to be a warlike culture. They're going to be a really sneaky culture. And that lends to where we have them today.
Absolutely. Which I know one of my points when I was trying to pitch to a player about Eberron who had never heard about it before, and one of the things that he loves is gnomes. And I said, you have this whole like gnome nation, and they're one of the best like spy type characters as far as like backgrounds and stuff go. Like you have this incredibly diverse, like the trust, and you have them like just filtered in throughout the nation of Corvair. And I was really just trying to pitch them hard on like gnomes. Gnomes are cool.
Yeah.
Like gnomes aren't. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean the gnomes. You know, to me, the thing about the gnomes is they're scary. You know, and that yes, it's that whole idea that the trust really is, to my mind, one of the most efficient intelligence agencies, you know, in Eberron. And I love the whole idea of if you go to Zilargo and just start messing around, they will just kill you. You know, that this is not a place to screw around. So anyhow,
one of the things I also enjoyed is, and I know you had mentioned it on the podcast Manifest Zone, is that you can have paladins, but because Eberron is not tied to like a alignment system per se, that you have paladins for like the Blood of Vol, you have paladins for the Church of the Silver Flame, you have paladins who are paladins because they believe in themselves, and that's where they gather their power from. And that was a fascinating conversation piece, because I was thinking in my head, how could I run a game where everyone has this different like outlook? Like it would just be so incredible. And that's one of the things I love about Eberron, is that you have these characters who are not your stereotypical Dungeons and Dragons characters, that they have these the things that tie them together beyond like obviously the last war, which has just ended, but you have that, you have where they're from, you have what they did during the war, you have where they want to go, and you get these characters who are just, it feels to me, playing in different settings and then playing in Eberron, that Eberron's just, I guess it's more, you get more story. You get, as long as the player characters or the DM is interested in doing that,
right,
you just get so much more out of it.
Well, and to me, that comes back to things like the noir inspiration of saying that we want characters in Eberron to feel essentially more complex. You know, you're not just a dwarf fighter. Well, okay, if you're a dwarf fighter, who'd you fight for? You know, and just sort of, again, how'd the last war affect you? What did you lose? Did you fight for the Moorholds? Were you working for one of the Five Nations? But coming back to your point about the religion, one of my favorite campaigns I ran, I had three of the characters, the player characters. One was a paladin of the Blood of Vol. One of them who was basically on the run from Caius, because Caius turned on the Blood of Vol and he was going to take vengeance and take back Karnath. One of them was a cleric of the Silver Flame, and his concept was that he was a changeling. He'd encountered corruption in the church and just been sort of baffled by it and couldn't get it. And so he'd sort of gone out into the world to try and basically walk the shady side of the street and figure out, like, what is this? So he knew how to deal with it. And a warlock whose premise was that they were drawing their power from one of the overlords of the First Age, essentially Cthulhu, if you will, basically on the concept that one of the overlords was going to rise and that their overlord would at least keep, you know, everyone might be enslaved or what have you, but they'd at least be more or less alive, as opposed to one of the other ones rising up and dissolving the world into chaos or driving everybody insane. And so really, he didn't want his guy to rise. You know, he wasn't excited about it, but he's like, if someone's gotta be there, it should be my guy. He's the best end of the world scenario we have to work with. And the first session we ran, literally the three of them just sat and debated religion for an hour, just in character. And it was, I'm just like, I don't even feel like moving the story on because I could just listen to you guys. And it comes to that point that, you know, people have asked, why don't you have evil gods, you know, like Bane in Eberron? And to a certain degree, we do. You know, we do have like the Dark Six and such. But part of my point is religions that thrive, as a general rule, they have values that the people who follow them see as positive. They have something about them that brings a community together. And so that's the point to me of saying the Blood of Vol outsiders may look at it and say, oh, they're creepy, they deal with undead. But I'm like, but what is it that makes a farmer choose to follow this religion? Like, what is it that makes it make sense to him? How does it answer questions about the world? And so this added to that idea of alignment, as you said, of basically what we're saying is the power source may be a positive or negative power source, but you can always have, even in the Blood of Vol, you can have a lawful good priest who's all about protecting their community, trying to lead them in the right way. And in the Church of the Silver Flame, you can have, an evil priest who's mainly in it because they're looking for the influence the position gives them, or simply because, the Inquisitor, someone who does terrible things, but because they truly believe they are doing what's best for the people they're tormenting or such. And so that ties back to the noir, as I said, of wanting that sort of complexity of you can't just say he's with the Silver Flame, he's a good guy. You can say he's with the Silver Flame so he thinks he's a good guy, but, people have done terrible things for good reasons.
Right. One of the things that I had come up back during the 3.5 era of Eberron was we started getting a lot of source books. Like we got The Secrets of Zendrick and The Secrets of Sarlona. And I always wondered, and I had a few other people that played Eberron or over the internet had asked, and we always talked about it, is where or how come there was never a book that focused on the rest of like the Corvair nations like Dargoon or Droam or Talenta
I wish
Plains.
there was, because again, frankly, Droam is one of my favorite nations just because it takes monsters in a very different way than they're usually handled in D&D. And I would love, it's one of the things we've talked about online a bunch. I love a book that was, Droam, Dargoon, Demon Wastes. And I can't really say. And, the thing to me is I really hope that, they will unlock Eberron soon for 5th edition. But really the ideal thing to me is for them to do with it what they did for Ravenloft, of opening it up to the DM's Guild. Because I know there's a lot of things I would really like to write about. I'd love to write more about, the goblinoids of Dargoon, or about the plains is another example of something that's very underdeveloped in Eberron. But I really can't realistically, looking at their production schedule and things like that, really imagine WotC it making sense for them to make a Plains of Eberron book. It's too specific. It's too narrow. But on the other hand, if they made it possible in the DM's Guild, I'd love to write that book. So we'll see what happens. But as I said, my hope is there's a lot of subjects that I can understand. This is really too narrow a focus for it to be just from a business standpoint, logical for them, but things I would absolutely love to write about if it became possible for me to do it. And right now, obviously, it's just not.
Right. And in the meantime, it seems like Eberron has kind of had a resurgence after 4th edition. After 4th edition, it felt like Eberron fell off a little bit, just from people I've talked to or online. And then you have these Facebook groups starting up, which are fantastic. And then Maze Arcana is the biggest one that I know of that is doing Eberron-themed gameplay. And then you, along with a few other people, have started a podcast called Manifest Zone. And I've talked with Christian for a different episode for this podcast, and it is great to talk to him because I love getting to listen to someone talk about Eberron for an hour or a little bit over an hour is fantastic. Getting to listen to multiple people, and including yourself, talk about Eberron, or I guess I should couch it as what Keith Baker would do in his Eberron.
Right.
But it's a fascinating podcast, and I love what it has come out so far from it.
And it's definitely the case. I, for years now, have always been doing sort of question and answer posts on my website, which is keith-baker.com, just so you don't end up at the kids books. And so I've been doing that. And again, I can't make new stuff, but I love talking about Eberron. And so when Christian came along and asked if I wanted to be involved in the podcast, I absolutely, again, I love talking about Eberron, even though, as you said, the whole point to me is this is what I would do. These are the answers I'd like. And in part, that's just because even in the core Eberron material that's out there, there's books I didn't work on. There are things within canon that contradict other things within canon. And to me all along, one of the basic premises we've always said about Eberron, from the morning on, is this is your world. What we've written is inspiration, but you should always be feel empowered to change it, to make it what you need for your story. So that's very much, whether it's on my website or on Manifest Zone, what I'm talking about is this is how I would do it. And if that makes sense to you, great. And if it doesn't, do something, do what makes sense to you.
Absolutely. And on that, I remember there's the conversation that there's a recent Facebook post. I think it was either about the Blood of Vol or the Carnathi skeletons, and how it was kind of not misrepresented, but it's like, oh, Carnath, there's just tons of skeletons walking around, and it's not that the case. Or Blood of Vol, like, oh, people misrepresent like what you're actually getting into as far as that. And those, like, your interactive, you're actually being involved in those discussions is incredible to have like that kind of feedback.
The Blood of Vol is one of those topics that if you get me started, I will, talk for hours. And so that was what happened is someone posted about that, and that led to a gigantic post on my website, which has actually continued. People add comments, and I add more to it. So, it's probably like 10,000 words at this point. And part of it is because that was one of those things that didn't get represented the way I always saw it in the original Eberron sourcebook. In the original Eberron sourcebook, the Blood of Vol does come across as a little more of, we are just evil. And I'm like, no, actually, they're grim. They have to me, they have an outlook on things that often puts them in opposition with forces like the Silver Flame. But that doesn't mean that they're evil. It means that they see things differently. To me, as I've always said, the core tenet of the Blood of Vol is that question, what just God would allow death and suffering? And that's a question we struggle with in this world. And I'm saying their answer is none. That if the sovereigns exist, they've basically cursed us with mortality so that we cannot rival their power. That it's basically a twist on the Garden of Eden story. And to me, it's taking a question that we as people do struggle with and taking an answer that for them makes sense and saying this does make them, these very grim, stoic, death is the end. We're at war with the universe, essentially, and tying to this sort of association with undead. But that, again, from their standpoint, it is still something that pulls them together, that binds them as a community. We need to stick together because we're all we've got. There is no benevolent force out there looking out for us. And that you have the Order of the Emerald Claw, who are one of our few, they are just straight out evil groups. And they're for the pulp side of things. They're Cobra. They're, but the point of that is they are extremists of a particular view of the Blood of Vol. They are not representative of the entire faith, if that makes any sense.
It does. It does.
And similarly, coming back to the Carnathi undead, it's the whole point of saying, we've always said these are sentient skeletons and zombies. And I'm like, okay, but that doesn't mean they're the people they were before, because if you just look at their stat blocks in the monster manual, they don't advance, they can't learn. And that already just says, okay, they're very inhuman. They are sentient. But it's not like a cheap form of raised dead. You're not just bringing Bob back as a skeleton. You're raising a skeleton from Bob's body, and it has martial skills, but it's not him. And that was sort of the thing I liked calling out, and the thing that I posted is, the idea that Caius has sort of locked away, put most of the undead army in these vast catacombs is in part because they're kind of creeped out by them. It's like, yeah, you know, if we've got someone to send these guys to kill, that's great. But we kind of worry that if we don't, that how long before they turn on us, you know?
Right.
And that with a Warforged, even though Warforged have all their own issues, their consciousness is more human. You know, a Warforged can learn. They do feel things the way we do. Whereas I'm saying a Karrnathi skeleton, its consciousness is not human. And you don't, you know, it may follow your orders, but don't think that you understand it. You know?
Right.
Because let's face it, I want undead to be creepy. You know, that's sort of part of their role in the world.
Getting away from Eberron, because you've done other things beyond Eberron.
Yes, I have.
And one of them is Phoenix Dawn Command, which you've posted about. I've caught some postings about how you can incorporate Phoenix Dawn Command into Eberron. But what is Phoenix Dawn Command for those who don't know?
So basically, because Eberron is sort of locked away in the vault, I can't write new material for Eberron. And so 5 years ago, maybe, I started working on just a new world. Just saying, if I want to be able to write fiction, if I want to be able to write new materials, I need to create a new setting. And originally, I was planning on that just being a system neutral thing, just a world you could use with whatever you were playing. But I was working with a friend of mine, Dan Garrison, and in one of our conversations, this idea came up of what if you had a role-playing game, you know, fantasy role-playing game in which death is actually how your character improves. You level up by dying and returning. I was just fascinated by this concept because the thing is, some of my favorite moments in sort of fantasy fiction, literature, movies are those moments when you get Gandalf holding the bridge against the Balrog. Or you get, you know, Boromir dying, you know, basically moments of sort of heroic sacrifice and such. And you can't really have those kind of moments in a traditional D&D game. If I made a scenario like the Mines of Moria and said, yeah, there's going to be this thing at the end that's just going to kill you all if you don't run away. That's kind of an obnoxious move for me as a game master. You know, that when I'm designing an adventure, I'm inherently going to try and make it relatively balanced so you feel like you have a choice, because if you die, that just sucks. So to a certain degree, what we wanted was to take what is traditionally the worst thing, the thing you're always trying to avoid in, you know, a normal D&D game, and actually make it one of the most exciting things, you know, tie it to the best thing. And because of that, that's when I then said, okay, if I'm going to do this, I do want to actually make a system that is tied around this. And so we made this not only new world, but also a new system. So Phoenix Dawn Command is a role-playing game. It is a fantasy role-playing game. The reasons behind that and sort of what makes it stand out, instead of dice, we use cards. And basically each player has a deck of cards that represent their sort of character's abilities. You have a couple of cards laid out in front of you that these are your sort of ongoing, this is how you fight, these are your skill specialties, these are sort of unique powers that you possess, your class abilities, if you will. And then you have a deck of cards that has sort of unique traits and abilities about you, but also is largely just things like strength 3, intellect 4, you know, that these are sort of a stat and a value. And so when you want to try and do something, you want to pick the lock, I'm going to say, okay, that's an intellect action. I need to see 15 intellect. And can you lay that out? And the thing about that is what it does is it gives the player a lot of narrative control in the moment. Because another thing I hate when I'm playing D&D is when we get the big dramatic moment where you're facing the final villain and you give your "my name is Inigo Montoya, you killed my father" speech, and you make your biggest attack and you roll a 1. And I'm just like, that's not how that scene was supposed to play out. This was supposed to be my epic dramatic moment and I rolled a stupid 1. And in Phoenix, the point is, you may not have what you need. From turn to turn, what you have in your hand is random. You're drawing it from your deck. But at least you know, looking at your hand, I do not have enough to pull off the big dramatic thing. So I'm going to do something else that I can do. With essentially it's saying, I know I'm going to roll an 8. So what can I do with an 8? And I'm going to save the big dramatic speech until I know I got a 20 in my hand. If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
This is tied to the fact that you also have a resource called sparks. And sparks are used to power your magical abilities, but you can also add them 1-to-1 to actions you take. So in other words, if I need a 20 to pull off that action and I only have a 14 in my hand, I can burn 6 sparks and make it a 20. And I can just buy that success. But the thing about it is when you run out of sparks, you die. And so it is always the question of, is it worth it? I can make this succeed, but is it worth expending that much energy or potentially dying in the process? And so Phoenix is this game where, again, the odds are stacked against you. The stakes are really high. You generally will lose 1 to 2 players in a session, but 9 times out of 10, death is a choice. It is something that you're dying because you're doing something amazing. You're holding the Balrog and taking him down into the canyon. You're throwing yourself on the bomb to save everyone else. And it just lets you have these sort of epic moments that don't really work in a game where death is the end. Now, in terms of death and rebirth, it's very much like Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. You don't come back right away. You don't come back where you died. So in a mission where the stakes are high, dying does have consequences. If the whole party, we say that there's a zombie outbreak in this village and you have 2 hours to contain it before it spreads too far to be stopped. And if you can stop it in 2 hours, it does not matter how many of you die in the process. But if you all die without having stopped it, by the time you're reborn, it's too late. We've lost that region, and you're going to have to deal with the consequences because the story isn't over. The other thing is that you don't have infinite lives. You can come back up to 7 times. So when you die, you come back and you're stronger, but you are also closer to the end. So the more you go, it's essentially saying as a 20th level character, you have all this power, but the next time you die, you're done. So be careful how you use it. Whereas when you're on your first or second life, you can go crazy. You can sort of take any number of reckless actions because what's the worst that can happen? And people asked right from the start, could I play this in Eberron? And I said, well, you could, but it's the thing is, Eberron isn't designed for it. Eberron is designed to tell any kind of story you can imagine. You can tell a spy story. You can tell a true crime story. You can tell, a war story. Phoenix is a war story. It is a war story with sort of survival horror elements. It is basically your world is being overrun by a wave of supernatural terrors. The dead are rising. We've got werewolves in the woods. We've got, this chant that people start chanting and trying to kill everyone around them. And we don't know how it starts, how it spreads, or why it's happening. Sort of any supernatural threat you can imagine, odds are good it's happening somewhere in the world and we don't know why or how these things are linked. So you've got this sort of Lovecraftian element of investigation is critically important, trying to understand these threats and why they're happening. Yet at the same time, these are things that are destroying the world actively. You've got to try. You are the only one with the power to make a difference, to stop these things. Can you do it? So my point is that Phoenix is a game designed to tell a story that is, life or death, stakes are high. Again, you've got 2 hours to save that village, and if you don't, we're losing the capital city to the plague, and that will have consequences going forward. Eberron, my point is, by default, the stakes aren't that high. Eberron is on the cusp of lots of terrible things could happen, but right now things are pretty stable. And so what I was saying is if you wanted to run Phoenix and Eberron, you'd want to set some terrible thing in motion. You'd want to say an overlord has risen, the Dalkir are unleashed. But you need these moments where it feels like laying down one of my lives is worth it. That, basically I am making this heroic sacrifice because I'm going to save hundreds of people in the process, or I'm going to get this vital information. And that's part of the flavor of it, is that you are in these situations where it is worth it to sacrifice yourself to accomplish your mission.
That is incredible. I mean, I've heard about it and I've seen what you've posted as far as just posting about and then how you can use it in the Eberron setting, but I haven't had a chance to play it. And now I'm going to have to go find it because I'll have to find a group of people to play it because it sounds cool with getting those moments to really be that heroic. And realistically, you do that in Dungeons and Dragons or any other role-playing game, but then you actively know, like, okay, I'm going to do this, but on the other side of things, now I'm going to have to make a new character.
Well, and the other side of it too is, even in D&D, when you get to high enough level, what you get is resurrection. And once you have resurrection, all the stakes go off the table. And the point of Phoenix is, you're going to come back, but that has a price, because you can only do it 7 times. And so it's not without consequence. The other thing is that when you die, when you were born, you gain new powers, you add new cards to your deck, but essentially your class, if you will, the school that you draw those powers from, is based on why you died. What are the lessons you're taking away from it? So, did you die because you weren't tough enough? If you'd just been a little tougher, you could have beaten that thing. Did you die because you sacrificed yourself to save others? Did you die just because you failed? And each of those will give you different sorts of abilities. So when you do die, we're not just going to say, oh, that was a bad roll or whatever. We're going to stop and say, why'd that happen? What did it mean to you? What does your character take away from it? And so by the time you're on your sort of 5th life, you really have this story. And it's really actively shaped the abilities that you have. And I really just enjoy it. It's a very different experience than a lot of other games. It is available, so it's Phoenix Dawn Command. It is available on Amazon. It is available on our website, which is phoenixdawncommand.com. And also any game store that gets Cards Against Humanity. Basically, Black Box is who we use for fulfillment. And if your store is getting Cards Against Humanity from Cards Against Humanity, they could get Phoenix from Cards Against Humanity. So if you prefer to use, your local store than internet, if they carry cards, they can carry Phoenix.
There's a good tagline there.
And the game, it's $65, but it is the box that you get has everything you need for the Game Master and up to 4 players. It comes with a 7-mission adventure path, which is sort of ready to go right away. But of course, it's a role-playing game. You can and should make your own stories and all of that. But I'm just saying, it does have just right away, ready to go. You got 9 sessions that you can just dive in on.
Awesome. Now let's talk about your newest Kickstarter project, which I've already backed, and I backed it at the highest level because I have intentions on using it as Christmas or birthday gifts for my friends that love cats, and that is Action Cats.
So Action Cats is something that came up at the end of last year. We were talking with some friends and just basically talking about crazy adventures of cats, and someone should make a game about that. And it was just sort of a silly thing. We came up with a bunch of like, ooh, it's the cat war game, or something like that. Came up with a bunch of silly ideas, but this one stuck in my head. And my thing is, I love collaborative storytelling. It's what I love most about role-playing games, is getting together, building stories together. It's what I love about my game Gloom. In Gloom, the mechanics work, but what's most fun about it is the stories that evolve from it. So Action Cats is a game about telling stories about cats. And essentially, each of the cards has a picture of a cat on one side. And all of our cats are, as we said, crowdsourced. Basically, if you play the game, you can submit a picture. Not play the game. If you back the game, you can submit a picture of your cat, and we'll consider putting it in the game. All the cats we've currently got are things that friends have donated. But basically, on the one side, you have a cat. On the other side, you have the beginning of a story and the end of a story. The game starts with someone who's the judge takes the top cat and they give it a name. So I say, this cat is Funky Whisker Beans. And then everyone else takes 2 cards from their hand, puts the 2 cards together to create the beginning and the end of a story. Now, that gives you a foundation. So the cards that I have may say, this cat was the first cat in space. And it's all your fault. So that's sort of what you get from Apples to Apples or Cards Against Humanity, a funny combination of cards. The point is that with Action Cats, that's the start. And you can just, when it comes to you, just read that off and be done. But the idea is, what you want to do is tell a story based on that. So how is this cat the first cat in space? Why is it your fault? Is it, oh, they walked into the capsule and you pressed the wrong button and they got launched into space? Is it that they've always wanted to go to space and it's all your fault because you bought them that telescope when they were just a kitten, and ever since they've been determined to go to the stars? That very much like Gloom, it's this point of you don't have to tell a story, but telling a story is it's sort of creating this foundation for things. And if I tell a story, then you might play off of what I said of, well, he is the first cat in space, but the thing of it is, and add your story on top of that. So what I like about Action Cats is it's incredibly simple. It's a deck of 160 cards. Basically anyone, when you look at the cat, you look at this cat, it's very easy to say, is this cat, does he travel through time? Does he start fires with his mind? And as I say, the cards give people a basis for coming up with things. But what I love is that a particular combination of cards, 3 different people may tell an entirely different story based on that. On my Facebook page right now, on my feed, I've just done a thing where I've actually said, post a picture of your cat and I'll post an Action Cat story about it. Mm-hmm. And so if you go back and look at that, they'll be old by the time people hear this, but you can still find it, I'm sure. You can see where what I've done is taken 2 cards, but then I've told a story about that specific cat. So you can sort of see how the game plays. The main thing is it's very simple. It's very family friendly. It's very easy to look at and say it's Cats Against Humanity, but I'll say, but it's something I look forward to playing with kids and with my parents, and, anybody who likes cats essentially is going to have fun with this game. And I figure after Gloom, with Gloom being a game where you have a family and you want them to suffer miserably and die, and after Phoenix, which is a game where you want your character to die, it was time to do something that was just straight up fun. And that's Action Cats.
Right. That's one of the things that I loved about it, is the family friendly aspect, because I'm always on the lookout for stuff that I can do with my kids. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I could retool or repurpose like certain role playing games maybe to get it to their level. But Action Cats just seems like straight out of the box something that they would love to do, because they're always telling me random stories about things that they're doing. And it's like, well, just add the cat in there and some helpful tips to start and end the story, and there you go.
That's exactly right. And that's sort of the point, is it's just, especially kids, is I've encountered the same thing with Gloom, is kids just love telling random stories. And that's the point, is what the cards give you is they give you, again, look at that cat, think about what that cat would do. And then the cards from your hand give you sort of a foundation to work with. But kids are going to have fun just sort of building off of that and coming up with their own depth. And it's one of the reasons that, again, the first thing you do is the judge names the cat. And part of that is because that itself is a starting point for a story. Is this cat just, Whiskers, or is this cat Fuzzykins the Destroyer? And that's going to generate some different stories.
I was going to say there's 3 pledge levels at this point. There's the 17 for 1 box, 34 for 2 boxes, or the pledge level that I chose was 67 for 4 boxes, with the intent that I'm going to give out 3 of them to friends or as presents, because I have tons of people that I know in my life that love cats.
And that's very much sort of the key with us with this, is that it's a simple game and we're keeping it simple. We're not doing lots of add-ons. We do have stretch goals, but the stretch goals are adding more cards to the game. If we do well, we'll get more cards in there for you. But basically, what we want to do, having done a bunch of Kickstarters at this point, is we're just like, this is going to be extremely simple. We're printing it domestically. We should be able to have this out by the end of the year. We should be able to get this to the printer in August, and you'll have it by Christmas. And so that's part of what I like about it, is, again, it's very straightforward. It's very fun. But it's just going to be, very quick and something we can get to you soon.
Absolutely. That's the other thing, because I had James D'Amato on from One Shot talking
Mm-hmm.
about Dungeon Dome, and that was the thing that we had talked about briefly, was the turnaround time from end of Kickstarter to actually having the product in your hand, or in his case, like online to watch or to get the extra like podcast episodes or PDF, is that this turnaround time on Action Cats is incredible. Like, at least the estimated turnaround time, I should say, is incredibly quick for something of this, whereas you might pledge something and not get it for a year and a half, and you go to the mailbox and it's like, what's this box? I have no idea what I did at that point, because I know with Kickstarter,
that happens to
I've
me
done
all
that.
the time. Yeah.
Yep. I'm like, what's this package addressed to me? I didn't order anything.
No, and that's exactly the point. And, again, having done Kickstarters, we've experienced that from that side. And that was why we chose, with Illimat, our previous Kickstarter, is just like, okay, there's flooding in China, and that adds a month to the time. And this is where we're saying, like I said, we're going to print it domestically. The game is already designed. The main thing we need to do is add cats. As I said, if you back the game, you get a chance to submit your cat. And well, the biggest challenge we're going to have is going through thousands of adorable cats and deciding which ones make it into the game. But again, like I said, it's a 3-week Kickstarter. It wraps up August 1st, and we should have it to the printer within 2 weeks is our theory. And with it local, that takes off a lot of, you don't have, when you're making things in a place like China, there's like you're adding 30 days at least for shipping, even once the game is done, let alone all the various things that can go wrong and delay. So yeah, that's one thing I'm excited about, is having worked on a lot of big, complicated Kickstarters. I'm looking forward to just making a game and having it into people's hands as soon as we can.
Absolutely. And the great thing is, if you have a cat at home, you can take a picture of that cat and submit it once you back it, because that's actually up and running now. I saw today, as we're recording this on the July 12th, and we've got 20 days left on this Kickstarter. You can now upload your pictures for consideration, and that is awesome.
And I'll go ahead and tell you, we say all this on the website, but the important things to consider, you want it to be portrait orientation because it's going on the back of a card, and ideally, you want something that people are going to look at and say, that cat has a story. Because all cats are adorable. That's just a fact. But, we're going to have, if we have 1,000 pictures, we want a cat that you look at and you think, that cat's traveled through time. Or that cat could be a pirate. So
exactly.
So anything that is particularly distinctive will certainly help.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to have this, the Kickstarter link in the show notes. Again, you have 20 days. I'll have this part of the episode up today on the 12th. So if anyone's listening, you have 20 days to get in there and back, and you will have a what looks to be a really fun game. And I mean, who can resist cats? Like, you can't. Even I'm allergic to cats, but I like the game.
Well, and that's the point to me, is even if you don't have cats or even like cats, you can still look at the picture and imagine a story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, again, that's the challenge to us is also, again, choosing pictures that make you look at that cat and say, what is that cat doing? What's that cat about? So yeah, Action Cats.
And what's next for you? I mean, beyond Manifest Zone, beyond Action Cats and Phoenix Dawn Command, is there anything on the horizon that you're working on that you can talk about? Or just you've got some projects that you're thinking of? Or
Well, I have a lot of things wrapping up. So Illimat, which is the game I made with the Decemberists, will be coming out in a couple of months. I made a deck building game based on Scott Pilgrim, the graphic novel and the movie, and that's coming out in a month or two. But moving forward, the main thing I'm actually working on right now is Phoenix. We've put Phoenix out. Now I'm doing more, you've seen just on my website, I've been doing more posts about it recently. We're working on new expansions for, additional cards. I'm working on a new sort of adventure path for it. And so basically we got Phoenix out, but we're a tiny little company. We're like a 2-person company. And so we got Phoenix out last summer, but because I was immediately pulled in on Illimat and Scott Pilgrim, I haven't had as much time to support it as I'd like. And so this summer, I'm really looking forward to really digging in and writing more for Phoenix so that people have a lot more stuff to work with. In addition, my wife and business partner, Jennifer Ellis, and I are also going to be going on a road tour in August into September, where we're going to be driving around demoing Illimat and Action Cats and other games just at game cafes around the U.S.
Oh, so, awesome.
And so, yeah, be doing that.
Will you have a tour list?
I'm sure we will.
On your website?
Yes, I'm sure we will. We're definitely going to be stopping at both Gen Con and Dragon Con, but along the way, we'll be stopping at local game cafes. And if you have a game cafe you want to recommend, if you go to my website, well, first off, you can find me on Twitter at @HellCowKeith, or you can go to my website, keith-baker.com, and there's a contact me button there. So if there's a place you think we should stop on our crazy gaming road tour, we have a Vanagame, so we say #Vanagame. Let us know.
Awesome. And I was going to say, for those that are interested in following you either online, it's keith-baker.com, HellCowKeith on Twitter. Anywhere else?
I'm Keith Baker on Facebook. And the thing you can see there is that my avatar has me both in my hat, which is usually recognizable, but also at the same time cosplayed as Black Bolt, because I was in Mockingbird, which is a Marvel comic made by Chelsea Kane, and there was an arc where Mockingbird goes on essentially what's called the Joko Cruise, and I was in that comic. So my avatar on Facebook is a scene of me from that comic. So if you see a guy in a costume from a comic panel, that's the Keith Baker you're looking for, not the children's book author.
I just have one last question before we wrap up, Eberron related. Mm-hmm. What is your favorite race in the Eberron world?
Questions like this are always incredibly hard for me because, favorite race, favorite religion, favorite thing like that. The point is, I love all of them. Like, people say, what's your favorite nation? And, well, I love Droam because I love what they do in monsters, but I love Zilario because, I love the change on gnomes. And to me, it's that sort of, they're all my babies, if you know what I'm saying.
Right.
So, was the question race, I think, was what you said?
Race, yeah.
Race, I think, in terms of just overall, if I had to pick something, I would say the Warforged, just because to me, I really like the questions of identity that you deal with there. To me, the whole point of the Warforged is you're essentially a sentient golem that was built for war, and now the war is over. And what does that mean? What are you? What is your purpose? And there's so many sort of interesting things you can explore playing Warforged characters. I'm, a huge fan of Philip K. Dick, of, Blade Runner in all its forms. And I loved those sort of questions of identity that you can play with as a sort of created entity. But as I said, I love all of them. So I don't think there's a bad answer.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Keith. I know that you are busy doing a lot of other projects, so I just want to say thank you for coming on, and thank you for Eberron, because it has made my life in role-playing wonderful.
Well, you are welcome, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you for listening to Tales from the Fandom. Subscribe to us on iTunes or your podcast app of choice. Follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Tales from the Fandom to see photos, links, leave feedback, and check out upcoming guests. If you'd like to be a guest, email David at talesfromthefandom@gmail.com.